Hare Krishna. Question: why are the Abrahamic religions so much against deity worship? Question from Panchapanda Prabhu. In your book Idol Worship, you mention how Moses had the image of the cow that the people were worshipping destroyed, and he even destroyed the people who were worshipping that. He ordered those people to be killed. So why do they have so much hatred against deity worship? We see that even Muslims, when they came to India, they destroyed deities. So what is the reason for such? Is it just religious fanaticism? But if Moses is the founder of Judaism, so even he seems to have that. So is it that there are some fanatical people who are against deity worship, or is it that even their spiritual leaders are against deity worship? Answer: we have to understand the difference between deity worship and idol worship. So what is opposed in the Abrahamic religions is idol worship, and they don't have any conception of deity worship at all. So what now we generally give the differentiation between idol worship and deity worship as a form made according to scriptural description, and a form that is for which pranapratishtha is done. But this conception is not there in the Abrahamic religions of a clear description of God's form. And because of that, the idea in those traditions is that God is transcendental and God is beyond any material representation. So because God is beyond any material representation, so therefore they say that any material representation of God is false, because God cannot be represented by anything material. So their idea is that whenever there is any material representation of God, then that is not actually God, that is a false representation. And people start worshipping that representation, and they forget the person who is being represented, they forget God who is being represented by that. And in that way, their idea is that the representation becomes a competitor to God. That means the representation was meant to be used to worship God, but people focus on the representation and forget what that representation is representing. And in this way, the representation, instead of taking people towards God, becomes an obstacle on the path towards God. And when that happens, then that obstacle, so people seem to be doing religious activity, but they are actually being blocked from going towards God. That's why in their tradition, they consider any material representation of God to be a false God, a competitor who needs to be destroyed so that the glory of the true God is established and people focus on the worship of the true God. So that's why in those traditions there are repeated references to desecration of the temples of the false gods and the destruction of their idols. And this is often celebrated as an act of religious glory. So that means the kings, when they conquer, if the kings are religious, then when they destroy the temples, they think that, oh, we have done something glorious, something which we should be proud of, by which we establish the glory of God. So desecrating idols is not an act of extreme religious fanaticism. It is an act which is very inherent to the tradition of Abrahamic religions. Even Muhammad, when he comes back to Mecca, he bashes up all the several idols that are present in the sacred place, the Kaaba. So in the sacred place over there in Mecca. So of course, in some Muslim historians' accounts, it is said that there is a representation of Jesus and Mary, and while everything else was being destroyed, he protected that and did not let get that destroyed. And of course, there are some other Muslim historians who compete that, and he said that afterwards he let that also be destroyed. But whatever, the point is that in these religious traditions there is no positive description of God, and therefore no representation can be made which is actually based on the original description of God. So even among even among various Christian tradition, even among various traditions within the Abrahamic religions. So there are some churches in which there are pictures of the religious heads over there, of some religious figures, pictures of Jesus, pictures of Moses, pictures of even God. So there is the idea of God with a long beard and God as an old man. So this is a projection. This is actually idol worship, where we imagine God having a particular form and then make that imagined form as an object of veneration. So actually the idea of God as an old person with a long beard, it is a false representation of God, and it repels people away from God. So the idea that all representations of God are similar is a incorrect extrapolation from this conception, and this incorrect extrapolation needs to be clarified and corrected. So in the Vedic tradition there is description of God's eternal form, and there is in the Pancharatra scriptures a description of how that form can be represented in the deities. So this whole conception of representing God through matter and letting those material representations become means by which we connect to Krishna, that conception is not there in the Abrahamic religions, and that's why they are so opposed to deity worship, because what their religious tradition is opposed to is idol worship. But because they don't know about the difference between idol worship and deity worship, so they assume the idol to be the same as the deity to be same as the idol, and then they oppose deity worship also, quite violently at times. So therefore, we as devotees, if we meet followers of these religions, then we have to give a proper philosophical understanding. And sometimes they may be so deeply ingrained in their preconceptions that even the most exhaustive philosophical understanding may not be adequate for clarifying to them. In fact, there are, within these Abrahamic religions only, there are conflicts. So in some religions, for example, in some denominations of Christianity, some kind of representations of God are allowed, and in some branches of Christianity it's not allowed at all. For example, there are the Amish who leave alone representing God in any way. They don't allow any photos of even people to be taken. They say that if we take photos of people and then we are attracted to those photos, then we are creating a false idol of God. So we are a false idol which will become an object of affection for us. Now this is extremism. So even in many branches of Islam, all types of art are banned, and that's why they don't have any. They have only floral designs in the mosques. So there are other denominations within this religion which oppose this. So especially when, say, Christians come to India, they even have deities of Jesus, because they want to attract Hindus, and they adopt the cultural forms of Hinduism so that they can attract people. So the point is that there are other places where they will destroy any material representation of any god, and in India they will come and make images of Jesus, even idols of Jesus. So the point is that there is internal confusion and internal conflict, because there is no clear understanding of God as a person and no clear description of God's form. So as devotees, we have to recognize that because of this very inherent opposition to idol worship, these religions at some level do pose a threat to deity worship as is described in the Vedic tradition. And that's why if we see that our acharyas worked when Aurangzeb was ruling, they worked to take the deities from Vrindavan to Jaipur, where Rajput king, Vaishnav king was ruling. So we shouldn't think that this opposition to deity worship is just the result of some fanatics within those religions and let our guard down. We have to protect the temple and the deities, but this protection doesn't necessarily mean that we have to start hating those religions or hating those religious followers. No, we have to give a proper understanding through philosophy, through logic, and through scriptural description. And we will see that many of these people, if we see most devotees in the first generation, that means Prabhupada disciples, many of them were Western bodied, and they were all brought up in this culture where where deity worship was, where any worship of God in any form was strongly opposed, and yet many of them have become leaders in deity worship, and they have devoted maybe years, decades, whole life for the service of the deities. So we shouldn't think that this misconception is a fringe misconception. No, it is a central misconception by about the antipathy towards deity worship. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we should hate people. What we should understand is that they need a much deeper philosophical re-education, and we should try to provide that as much as possible. And we cherish the blessing that we have been connected with a tradition where we have the opportunity to get glimpses of the all attractive form of Krishna through the deity. Thank you. Hare Krishna.